Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Bible study. Today we are talking about Psalm 90, and we have a very interesting author, someone we haven't talked about in quite a while. Before we get there, you can download this PDF for free on our website. There's a link down in the description if you want to get it, and there are now hundreds of these online that you can download all for free. Now, let's talk about Psalm 90 and our special author. We have a guest appearance here. Our author today is Moses. So evidently this was something that Moses wrote back when he was alive. That's now included here in the Psalms. And we also have a New Testament reference in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. So after this study, remember to go look that one up. There are a few overarching themes in this chapter. The first one, the eternality of God, or the eternal nature of God, compared to the short life of men. And number two, Moses' prayer for God to give his people, the people of Israel, wisdom. In our definition section today, I have Moses, and the reason is because we haven't talked about him in quite a while. So somebody might be doing the Psalms, and maybe you don't know who Moses is. So Moses, you can read about his life in the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. He was the man who God chose to lead the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and lead them to Canaan, or lead them to the Promised Land. Two sections today. The first one is verses 1 through 11, the eternal God and the short life of men. So Moses begins Psalm 90 with a meditation on the eternality of God. God was around before anything existed, before the earth was formed, before the mountains were made. He says in verse 2 that God is from everlasting to everlasting. To him, 1,000 years is like one day. And the lives of men are nothing in comparison to him. He says that men are like grass or flowers in the field. They spring up, they have short lives, but then they're quickly replaced by others. Like a swift flood that displaces everything in its path, so men and women living on the earth are very quickly wiped away. And Moses says that sometimes it's God's anger and wrath that puts an end to men's lives. And Moses certainly would have been uniquely aware of this because he had to watch an entire generation of the Israelites die in the wilderness because of God's judgment on them for their disobedience. And that was when they were in the wilderness for 40 years on their way to the Promised Land. And speaking of disobedience, Moses says that all men's sins are known to God. God's light exposes even secret sins, and all of them are going to be subject to God's judgment. Moses wrote that a man was lucky to live to be 80 years old, and even if he managed it, his years were going to be full of toil and trouble and sighing. So on one side we have God, who's holy, who's sinless, who's perfect, who's eternal. This other side we have men who are sinful many times, who live very short lives, lucky to live 80 years, and their lives are hard. Much of that is because of sin. That brings us into section number 2, verses 12 through 17. Teach us to number our days. So the sinfulness and the frailty of humans was weighing heavy on Moses. So he prays to God for mercy and for wisdom for his people to know their place under the sovereignty of the eternal God. And this is what he prays in verse 12. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Moses asked God to have pity on his people, to show them love so that they could rejoice through their days rather than sighing their way through life. Moses' people had experienced many days of God's anger, which they deserved, but Moses asked God to show them grace and to replace those days of anger with days of gladness. And that takes us to our application. Let's talk about this idea of numbering our days. As I've reached certain ages in my life, it's caused me to think about how much time I potentially have left. And I guess this is probably something everybody who begins to get older experiences. I remember turning 25. That was a while ago. and thinking that, well, if I only live to be 75, I've lived a third of my life. And now I'm approaching middle age, I suppose. Maybe not quite there yet, and now I'm thinking, well, if God only allows me to live to be 70 or 80, and that would be a blessing, I've lived almost half of my life. Those thoughts can be depressing. I guess they can make us sad, and sometimes they lead people into having midlife crises. While those thoughts are unpleasant to us many times, the truth is, I think those are very healthy thoughts. Our lives are short, which is the point that Moses is making here, and we need to begin thinking about meeting the eternal God sooner rather than later. So let those thoughts sober you and humble you and be thankful that God gives them to you. It's better to number your days when you still have days left than to allow death to creep up on you and find you when you're unprepared to meet this great, holy, eternal God that's described in Psalm 90.